Good afternoon and welcome to the 2020 Online Economic History Workshop with the theme of Responding to Crisis. I'm Frank Garman at Christopher Newport University, here with Aaron Hansowitz of Bethany College, who's handling the technical stuff in the background today. Together, we've organized this economic history workshop to try to make these presentations accessible. And today we have two panelists. We have João Pereira dos Santos from the Nova School of Business and Economics, who will be speaking on the effect of the Spanish Civil War on the Portuguese stock market. Next, we have Francois Velde from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, who will be giving a talk on the economic impact of the 1918 Spanish influenza on the American economy. After both presentations, Gabriel Mathy from American University will serve as discussant and reflect on both presentations. And finally, we will open the panel up to comments and allow them to respond from questions from both Mathy and from you, the audience. You may submit questions for consideration by posting them on Twitter with the hashtag OEHW2020, or you may post them directly to the YouTube video where we will be fielding them. I recommend that you submit your questions as soon as possible so that we can receive them in time to submit them to our panelists. Remember that the works that you'll hear here today are works in progress. Your questions and feedback can help our panelists in improving their research. We now begin our panel Responding to Crisis with João Pereira dos Santos' presentation on the effects of the Spanish Civil War on the Portuguese stock market.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me? So good afternoon, everyone from sunny Lisbon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this ongoing paper. This is joint work with Diogo Leitão, who is now at Banco de Portugal, with Jaime Marques Pereira, who is now at Bocconi University, and with José Tavares, who is a professor at Nova. The Spanish Civil War, ranging from 1936 to 1939, was unprecedentedly bloody and unpredictable. It pitted Spaniard against Spaniard, enthused with contending ideologies to fratricide violence with the use of new weapons, paving the way to the Second World War and indiscriminate warfare. The world paid attention, got involved, and took sides. Portugal, whose only land frontier is with Spain, was not an exception. In this paper, we ask what was the impact of the Spanish Civil War on the stock returns of the Lisbon Stock Exchange. What do we do? So we examine investors' reaction to news from the Spanish War using a panel of weekly returns. So these are taken at the weekly level, so which is a big improvement considering the historical background. So almost 90 years ago, and we have data at the weekly level. So, and these news were classified by us according to, first, their military or political nature, and second, which contender came out favored, if they were the Republicans on the left or the Nationalists on the right. We ran static and dynamic econometric specifications, and we control for time invariant stuff with firm and month fixed effects. So if I do not have enough time to get until the end, I just want to, as a spoiler alert, I want to say that so we find that the Spanish Civil War events affected returns negatively, especially events that are military and pro-Republican. So just very quickly, a few words about the onset of the Spanish Civil War. So the Second Spanish Republic was established in 1931, And this was followed by 5 years of political instability and violence. In 1936, the left-wing Republican coalition wins the general election, but then there is a coup d'etat in Spanish Morocco, led by General Franco, and the Spanish Civil War starts shortly after. So in 1926, following 60 years of instability during the turbulent First Republic in Portugal, there is a military coup that leads the establishment of a military dictatorship. It is during this period that António de Oliveira Salazar, which was a finance minister at a finance professor at Coimbra University, was asked to become the Minister of Finance. And after 6 years of strict rule over Portugal's public finances, Salazar establishes a right-wing dictatorial regime called Estado Novo, New State, in 1932, with Salazar as a dictator. His vision for Portugal was that of a conservative, nationalist, Catholic, and capitalist bastion. And in terms of economic policy, the Estado Novo regime proved to be very interventionist, with heavily regulated business sector, closer relationship between the regime and business owners, and, which is interesting for our setting, very protectionist trade policies. So there was no trade between, there was marginal trade between Portugal and Spain. It's nothing like we see today. Portugal was essentially a closed economy, and it was trading with the African colonies of Mozambique, Angola, and São Tomé and Cape Verde. So let me tell you a few words about why our paper is different from what we find in most of the literature. So one important reason is exogeneity. The war events in this setting are clearly exogenous, we argue, to the firms listed in the Lisbon Stock Exchange. So this paper is different from the others, from the existing literature, or from most of the existing literature, as we measure the spillover impact of a conflict from another country's to another country's market, instead of measuring the impact on the market of the country suffering the conflict itself. Moreover, we argue that in our setting, we can get some sensibility to the conflict due to geographical traces. So in our setting, we will have firms that are in Portugal mainland, but are also in African colonies. So the firms in Portugal mainland are very much are very close to the theater of operations, to the war. But the Portuguese colonial firms that are traded in Lisbon, but they are operating in Africa. So they are not. So there is not a fear of. There's no fear that they are vulnerable to the destruction of their assets. But they still remain vulnerable to the political outcomes of the war. And the last reason is partisanship. The Portuguese regime was rightly perceived as favoring the nationalist side. However, we should point out that the regime did not want an easy nationalist victory for the reason that they feared a strong unified Spain. There were the fear that a strong unified Spain by Franco would be capable of invading Portugal. So Salazar's support was a leverage gaining strategy. So it was trying to gain leverage with Franco and this new regime. So there are basically two possible mechanisms. Since trade with Spain was not that important, there are two main mechanisms that we try to analyze and to test here. One of them was the fear of war, what we call war next door. So it was the fear that the violence spreading over the border with flow of refugees coming to Portugal, and even the conflict itself being able to destroy physical assets. And the other potential mechanism is the Reds are coming. So the Salazar regime was a right-wing regime, and they were against they were a bastion against the democracy, but especially against communism. And In this setting, we will have data from firms that are very much close to the regime. So if it's true that this stock market, the stock exchange market is not that very much representative of the whole population, it is nevertheless very representative of the business elite that was close to the Portuguese regime. And that's what we are trying to tackle. So let me quickly point out that there are many advantages from using stock price return data to assess the impact of events. So, these include the fact that capital markets capture the expectations of investors. If there are mistakes, they are costly, so it's a high stakes game, and there's accuracy from marginal traders. Let me point out your attention to at least this last paper from Martin Assenha and co-authors. And in this working paper, they established the relationship between the outcome of military events and the state of the economy for both the nationalists and the Republicans. And they show that, at least in the early years of the war, both sides had very much the same financial resources. So it was completely unpredictable who was going to win. So zooming in our paper. So we use data from Portuguese firm stock return. These stock prices are extracted from the work of Mathy and co-authors from 2017. That themselves, they extracted the stock prices from handwritten bulletins de cotações that were available in several archives throughout Lisbon. So the prices were collected for each Wednesday, and then when there was no Wednesday, they would collect either Tuesday or Thursday. And the returns, of course, are calculated using logarithms. So we are trying to understand what's the impact of particular events, and Not be more careful about those. But I want to right now point out that these events were not cherry picked. So we went to chronologies made by the University of Warwick and Rankers, and we combined these with events for Portugal from this foundation, and we classify them according to their nature and to the side that was favored in the outcome of the war. For transparency, in the appendix of this paper, we show all the events that we consider in our work and exactly how we classify them. For precision, we also use other control variables. For example, the UK return was collected from the London Stock Exchange Market, and the Portuguese interest rate was collected from the archives of Banco de Portugal. So what we do in respect to our methodology, so we are examining the return of firm I in week T in month M, and then we are doing a within firm analysis. So we have firm fixed effects, we also have month fixed effects, and our coefficient of interest is gamma. So the impact of a particular event, these are dummy variables in a sense, and I'll show you exactly how we classify them. For precision, as I said, we also include the vector of control variables in some specifications for robustness. One of these being, let me call your attention that one of these being the return in the week before. So we conditional the information that investors had on 1 week before, and we try to analyze the impact in some specifications, the impact of a particular event, new event that is taken in week T, but we condition the event is measured in week T, but we condition on what investors do 1 week before. And standard errors are, of course, clustered per firm. So these events, which are the ones that we are that are the coefficients of interest in our analysis. So we classify event if there's at least one event related to the Spanish Civil War. If the nature of the event was political or military. And we also have if it favored the Republicans or the Nationalists. On your right, you have a map of the evolution of the war between July 36 and February 39, and you can see how the war evolved across time. We also, furthermore, we also have cross variables. We also created cross variables, including, so if an event was military and favoring the Republicans, political in nature but favoring the Republicans, military in favoring the Nationalists, or political in favoring the Nationalists. So let me jump to the results. So in the first three columns, we see that if there was an event related to the Spanish Civil War, this had a negative impact on the stock market in Portugal. And this is true if we do not have that, if we do not have any return. So this instead of, so with on top of month fixed effects and firm fixed effects, if we have what the investors knew 1 week before the result holds, and if we also have a dummy variable that was considering events that were happening in Portugal that were not like there was 1 or 2 revolutions against the revolutions though, but small revolts, like there was an attempt of killing Salazar in this period. So we also control for these, and the results are still there, and statistical precision remains. So if we divide these events between military and political, we see that the effect is coming mainly from the events that are military in nature. In addition, we also have we also compare events that are nationally in favor of nationalists or in favor of Republicans, and we can see that most of the action seems to be going on. So if there was an event favoring the left, the regime was fearing that, so there was a higher probability that the communists and the anarchists would win Spain, and then there was the fear that this would create spillovers to movements also in Portugal. So the regime and the business elite supporting the regime we find suggestive evidence that that was the case. When we combine these two things, so the nature and the side that was favored by a particular event, we can see that this action is coming from events that are military in nature and favoring the Republicans. You can see that in this coefficient. Well, moreover, we do a lot of a battery of robustness checks to try to see if our event is robust to these exercises. The first one, we use only a balanced data set. So before we had like firms that were there all the time, but we also had firms that were going in and out of the sample because they were not being traded in particular weeks. If we focus our attention in firms that were there every time, the result still holds. We have that in the paper. We also, the result holds if we have month type of firm fixed effects. If we exclude the year of 1939, the last year of the sample where the outcome of the war was basically decided and so on, and the result still holds. I just want to show you a placebo test that we did. So we imagine to see what happens if the events took place not in the week that they indeed took place, but what happens if they took place 2 weeks before. And we see that if we can get any correlation with this, and the answer is no. There's basically nothing statistical significant here, showing that the events are very much precise to what we are trying to capture here. We also have a division between domestic and colonial firms, and we see that the firms that are really worried about the onset of the war are the domestic firms, the ones in mainland Portugal. The coefficient for colonial firms is not statistically significant. It's even though the point estimate is very negative, but it's imprecisely measured. So to conclude, I think I'm running out of time. So to conclude, in this paper, we uncovered evidence of a causal impact of the Spanish Civil War on the Lisbon Stock Exchange. And we show that pro-Republican events generate a significant and negative effect on the Portuguese stock returns. So this is what we call the reds are coming. But this is combined with the fact that military events also generate a significant and negative effect, the war next door. So, and we argue that this constitutes a new step in the literature since we are measuring the spillover effects of an armed conflict in one country so there was no physical destruction in Portugal. It was only the fear that this would come or that the Reds would come. Thank you so much for your time, and you have here my email if you have any questions and you are not able to ask them during this hour that we have. Thank you so much.
Okay, next we have Francois Velde, who will give a presentation on the 1918 influenza and its effect on the American economy.
All right, can everyone hear me and see the screen? All right. So the usual disclaimer applies. I work for a central bank, but that doesn't mean I speak for them. I'm going to be talking about the impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic on the US economy, and I'm going to be looking at it through high frequency data. I don't think it's too hard to motivate the relevance of this pandemic. We're in the middle of another one. There aren't that many that have occurred. This is in fact the most recent of a similar size. There are also many similar issues that surround policy questions about lockdowns, how long should they be, are they effective? And for 1918, at least if you're willing to dig a bit, there's a fair amount of data that's available. So my approach is first, I focus on the US only. I wish I had the time, energy, and resources to study lots of other countries, but at this point, it's only the United States. Second, my horizon is 0 to 2 years. So it's really on impact and in the short to medium term. I'm not looking at long-term persistent effects. And I'm trying to look at as high frequency data as possible, and you'll see why. And also it's a variety of both aggregate and cross-section data. The punchline is that there was a recession in 1918-1919, whose onset coincided with a pandemic, but it was, in the words of Burns and Mitchell, the grandfathers of business cycle research, of exceptional brevity and moderate amplitude. It had a very sharp impact, mostly through the labor supply, but it was followed by a very rapid rebound and no lasting effect. And in fact, I find suggestive evidence that most of the recession was due to the armistice of November 1918, which almost coincided or followed very quickly after the epidemic itself. There were closings, the equivalent to our lockdowns. They did slow the dynamics of the epidemic, and their cost, the economic cost was mitigated. I find suggestive evidence for that again, because reducing infections reduced output loss. So the mitigating measures were not as costly as they might have been otherwise, but that's kind of a peculiarity of that epidemic. So I'm going to quickly go over the relevant features of the 1918 epidemic. First, start looking at aggregate time series, and then dive into cross-sectional variation, both at the state and at the city level. So this is a time series of the total mortality rate for the US on a monthly basis at an annual rate. And you can see a seasonal pattern. The blue line is total mortality, and the red line is all but pneumonia and influenza. At the time, let's just say it's simpler to lump together deaths due to pneumonia and to influenza if we want to catch the burden of the epidemic, of the influenza epidemic. So the distance between the two lines is deaths due to influenza and pneumonia. You can see that there was a seasonal pattern, so deaths due to influenza happened every year, but there is a huge exception in 1918. In fact, there's a little bit, you can see a trace of the so-called Herald wave in the spring of 1918, a slight bump here. And then you can also see that in 1920, there was also exceptional mortality. There was something peculiar about the 1918 pandemic is its impact by age group. So on the horizontal axis is the age group, and on the vertical axis, the PNI mortality rate in the US. And you can see that the years, normal years are the lines without any dots. And they have the same pattern that the mortality is pretty high for infants, high above the age of 60, but pretty low for the other ages. And then you can see how the 1918 pandemic, the light blue line, is really unusual in that it hit the age groups 20 to 40 very badly. And even the 1919 and 1920s patterns still have a little bit of that, and then it disappears after 1921 and 22. So this is an important fact, the fact that the 1918 Spanish flu hit the working age people, both incapacitating them and also with a fairly high mortality rate. This is data from 47 US cities. I'm trying to represent quickly the geographic spread of the epidemic. So it's a contour plot of mortality rates. The cities are ordered on the vertical axis by distance from Boston, where it all began in late August of 1918. So as we're going up the vertical axis, we're moving away from Boston all the way to San Francisco, California at the top. And on the horizontal axis are the weeks, starting in September and all the way to the end of March 1919. And yellow means very low mortality, and all the way to blue means very high mortality. So a number of features are visible here. You can see the spread of the epidemic going westward, especially in the early portion here, this diagonal. You can see that there's a lot of variation in terms of how badly the cities were hit. Some were hit much harder than others. And you can also see, for some cities, but not all, a second wave. So there's the first wave in October, November, and then in a number of places, but not everywhere, there's a second wave in December or January, which is generally not as high, in fact, much milder than the first wave in terms of mortality. So lots of variation across cities. And the important point also is that all of this happens very quickly. This is a matter of weeks. So this is what I said, the second wave, much less severe. There were a number of policies that were enacted at the time, so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, decided mostly at the city level, which we might call, some of them we might call social distancing. Almost all the cities closed schools, churches, entertainment places, large gatherings. Notable exception was New York City. Almost nowhere were closings beyond that group. So other businesses were typically not affected. In some cities, there were efforts to reduce congestion in public transport, so there were staggered business hours, but no closings beyond those of entertainment places, restaurants, bars, and so forth. And also there was some quarantine and isolation of infected individuals, but those would have little or no economic impact. So I'm going to focus on closings when I'm trying to measure economic impact. This shows the duration of closings in various cities. Not all cities had closings. New York City did not have closings. The orange line here represents the staggered business hour. The median duration of these closings was 28 days. So these closings, their equivalent of lockdowns, were not very long. And again, you can see some amount of dispersion, temporal dispersion across cities, but the variation is not that large. It's really a matter of a few weeks. So if you want to distinguish any effect, you need pretty high frequency data. So what was the impact of the epidemic? Well, let's start at the very top, GDP. Well, the series we have for that time period are annual, and they really don't show very much. In fact, 2 of the 3 possible series actually show an increase from 1918 to 1919. The Balky-Gordon series does show a bit of a decrease from 18 to 19, but there's really not much visible here. You can contrast that with what happens in 1920-21 when there's a fairly famous recession that's quite visible, and we'll see that coming back again. So if you want to see anything, we have to dive into higher frequency. So let's look at a few series. Industrial production, this is a monthly series. The yellow stripes are the NBR the recession dates. Yep, you can see a little bit of an effect in 1918, bottoming out in March of 1919, and then bouncing back up pretty quickly. In contrast, the 1920-21 recession is very sharp and of a much longer and much deeper. If we look at auto shipments, same pattern. Yes, we can see the 1918 recession, but it pales in comparison with the 20 recession. Retail, it's really kind of hard to find much of an effect. The paper discusses the limitations of the data, but for what it's worth, there's a little bit of an Amazon effect. If you look at mail order, it went up during the epidemic and then back down again. But overall, not a huge impact. We have a few employment indices for New York State. The BLS had started collecting an aggregate national index, but it was still very limited. Wisconsin, Ohio, Massachusetts. Again, same pattern. You can see a downturn in 1918, bottoming out in March of 1919, and then very quick rebound, and nothing like the very drastic recession in 1920-21. Bank clearings is a measure of payments volumes that's available at the time on a monthly or even weekly frequency. Again, the same type of picture. Business failures, very interestingly, measured by a couple of firms. Nothing whatsoever. In fact, there's a downward trend in business failures throughout this period, which is not interrupted in any way by the 1918-19 recession. Again, contrast that with the impact of the 2021 recession, where business failures increased very quickly, both in number and volumes. This is another measure from Dunn, another firm, same picture. So let's move on to the cross section. Without getting into too much details, there's various levels that are available, states and monthly or cities and weekly. It's really all conditioned on where we have mortality data available. So the task is try to find high frequency series that match up with the mortality data that's available. So I'll be talking about some data for manufacturing in New York State, a little bit in Massachusetts as well. The coal industry has some very interesting data. The paper has a bunch of additional data on banks, on business failures. Again, using the cross-section, I'm skipping in the interest of time, but the upshot is kind of the same as the picture that we got from the aggregate level, very or little or no impact. This is manufacturing in New York State by various regions. So there's 7 industrial districts for which we have monthly employment figures. The dashed vertical line is the month of October, and you can see an impact. Something happens in that month and a very quick rebound to November. And then starting in December, most regions experience a fairly sharp drop. So this is the 1918-19 recession, but you get a sense that there's actually maybe 2 distinct events, something in October and then something starting in December. If we look at the growth by region, so there's only 7 regions, it's a small sample, granted, but if you regress the growth from December 1918 to June 1919, so the downturn that followed, if you regress that on the growth that took place from the beginning of the war, April 1917, to September 1918, right before the epidemic, the correlation is very tight. In fact, if you remove the outlier of Rochester, it's incredibly tight. So almost all of the downturn that followed from December 1918 to June 1919 is explained by the growth that took place before the epidemic. What's left to explain for the epidemic, that's on the right panel. There's a little bit, and there's a little bit of a negative relationship, but in terms of quantity, it really explains very little of the recession. So this is, I find that's very interesting data. Massachusetts, we don't quite have data. We have data by industry, and we have mortality data by town. And so I'm going to compute the exposure of industries to the epidemic by the share of industry employment in the various towns. So it's kind of an indirect picture, but the result is similar to the one that we saw in New York. Most of the downturn, in fact, the slope is almost identical. The downturn from December 1918 to June 1919 is almost entirely explained by the growth during the war up to August 1918. And what's left to be explained by the epidemic, there's a significant relationship, but it's really quite small. So most of the downturn in manufacturing is explained by the armistice. For the coal industry, we have lots of information at the weekly level, reports from the various mines indicating to us the percentage of capacity that was used, and for what was not used, the reasons for it. Labor shortage, absence of market, so lack of demand, mine disability, car shortage. Blue is production. So the blue line shows you the graph of production. You can see it peaking in October of 1918. There's a few sharp spikes that are due to holidays. Here is the epidemic. You can see the downturn here and then the very sharp rebound. And there's anecdotal evidence or qualitative reports that tell us that indeed the mines were hit by the lack of demand. Of labor, incapacitated by the flu. Very sharp rebound. And then again, the same pattern. Once the armistice takes place, there's a very large downfall. This is the pattern of capacity unused. How much of the coal was not used, of the capacity was not used due to the labor shortages. It correlates very well with the epidemic. So here on the horizontal axis, I have the cumulative excess mortality by state. And on the vertical axis, the cumulative lost production by state over the period of the epidemic. And you can see they're straight lines, not with the same slope. So the effect of the epidemic is not the same on the different in the different states, but the loss of output is directly related to the loss of the impact of the epidemic, the mortality. But do these cumulative mortalities help explain the subsequent downturn, the absence of market? Here is the cumulative excess mortality or the cumulative lost production from labor shortage on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, the loss in production due to the lack of demand in the months that followed, and there's really no relationship. So there's no evidence of a connection between the labor supply shock and the following demand, the lack of demand for coal. Finally, at the city level, the data that I use is taken from Bradstreet, a weekly publication, which reported a number of a lot of information. Some is bank clearings, I've mentioned that before, volume of payments, and then a qualitative description of business conditions, which I converted into an index business condition. So this is trade at a glance. For the various cities, there's an adjective that describes the situation of wholesale and trade, retail trade, manufacturing, and so forth. Let me go very quickly. What I do in the paper, and I'll just show this very quickly, is I take a basic SIR model, susceptible, infected, recovered model, which gives you the dynamics of the epidemic as a function of the fraction of infected and susceptible and recovered. And I assume that the transmission coefficient, the beta, can change with closings. And I also add an equation for output, which is also affected by closings. The only thing that we can observe are deaths. We don't observe infections. We don't have case data of good quality. So I'm going to recast everything in terms of death rates. So we get equations on the dynamics of the death rates. And in these equations, with the appropriate time subscripts, we can put in the effect of the closings by interacting a dummy for the closings. So I'll capture the beta effect. And the regression results are here. I use this both on this index of business conditions as well as on the clearings. This is the dynamics of the epidemic, and then the one sub-T dummy is the dummy for closures. What we see is that first, the dynamics of the epidemic are affected by the closures. We also see that the closings improve economic conditions because they reduce the number of infected. So the closings, if you back out the coefficients from the estimated regression coefficients, you can see that the closings reduce the R, the reproduction number, from a range of 2.5 to 3, which is consistent with what the epidemiology literature has estimated for the 1918 epidemic, to the range of 1.2 to 1.7. So cuts it in half, although it doesn't quite bring it below 1 to stop the spread of the epidemic. We see that future deaths affect current output, and that's simply because future deaths are predicted by current infections. So current infections, people incapacitated by the epidemic, reduce output. We can infer what the loss of output from the infections is from the business conditions index on the order of 50–60%. And we find that closings reduce or that channel by 5%, although the estimate is not not significant. And the direct impact of closings on activity is also on the order of 5%. So a fairly small impact of closings on activity, a pretty big impact on R. So what's the difference between 1918 and 1920? Obviously, the economy was very different. It was a much more rural, much more agricultural, different economic structure. The size of the government was different, and the activity of the government at the time was very different. In 1918, government is running a massive deficit financed by debt. The Fed is busy lending to households and banks so that they can buy the federal debt. So there's extremely accommodative fiscal and economic policy. Financial markets actually did quite well during that time period, as shown by this graph of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which you can see actually went up during the pandemic and then went back down after the armistice. Nothing like the impact of the 1920 recession, as usual. And also the NPIs were really much less aggressive than the lockdowns that we've had. And I'll illustrate this with some mobility data. This is earnings of various street cars, electric railway companies in various cities. And over this time period, you can see that all of them are hit in the month of October. But you can see that the size of the hit is on the order of 10 to 20%, and then the rebound is pretty quick. So that suggests that there was a reduction in mobility in urban areas, but it was fairly short-lived. It was not very large, and it was fairly short-lived compared to the measures that we see nowadays. And we can also see that they're actually not directly related to the intensity of the closings. So in this picture, I'm showing on the horizontal axis the excess deaths, and on the vertical axis, the change in the streetcar revenue. So take that as a measure of mobility. So as we're moving to the right, it means that deaths are going up, so mobility is reduced. So that's the downward slope. But compare, for example, Philadelphia here. The size of the dot indicates the proportion, the portion of the month that was due to closings. So that looks like maybe everything is due to the closings. There's a very sharp move to the right and then back to the to zero. But compare that with San Francisco over here, where they're September, October, and November. You see that mobility keeps going down, even though the closings are not that stringent. So there's a suggestion here of an endogenous responsive mobility. People were aware of trade-offs at the time. I discussed this at greater length in the paper, but why did they not have stricter lockdowns? Well, they thought those were too costly. The living necessities of a community outweigh the more rigid but more consistent measure of a total closing. Those cities which tried total closing methods did not bear with them except for a very short period. And here again from the same report, and there's other reports of other cities where you can see that when the hardship of a general closing of business exceeds the problematic value of the life-saving measures caused by such closing, it becomes necessary to take the lesser of the two evils and allow commerce to pursue its way. So they perceived a trade-off, and they made a different choice on the trade-off frontier. So not maybe the expected impact. People have been going back to the Black Plague and other catastrophes to forecast gloom and doom. The impact of the 1918 pandemic is visible, but it's definitely not as large as 1920, and there's a very quick rebound. And most of the recession itself seems to be due to the armistice. It's also very hard to find an affected state variable that would explain any long-run effects. Like I said, business closings, banks operated well, the financial system was not affected, business failures did not increase. So it's hard to find a mechanism for long-run effects, at least at this level of analysis. As I said, the context was very different. Perhaps the intense monetary and fiscal policy left no room for coordination on a bad outcome. So I certainly acknowledge that the circumstances were different. I'm not predicting that this pandemic will not have any impact. I'm just making the point that a pandemic need not be a disaster. And it's also interesting to see that 2020-21 shows that bad monetary policy can perhaps do a lot worse. Thank you.
And now we have Gabriel Mathy, who's going to serve as discussant for the two papers. So I'll turn the floor over to him.
Okay, thanks very much. Everybody seeing that? Okay, let's go to. All right, thanks so much. Muito obrigado, João. I'm really happy to discuss this paper. I have a special interest in the Spanish Civil War. So let's dig right in. You saw the paper just a few minutes ago. So we're talking about returns on the Portuguese stock market during the Spanish Civil War. So here you can see some of the major events and what happens to stock returns. So if you look, actually, there's a lot of action, not necessarily during the Spanish Civil War period, but actually during the kind of start of World War II in Europe. And so this might be a suggestion for a follow-up paper because of the context of the Spanish Civil War in the Iberian Peninsula. You know, it might seem obvious today that the Iberian Peninsula would remain neutral, but in fact, there were prospects, as the author mentioned, as João mentioned, that Spain would invade Portugal. There's also the possibility that Germany and the Axis powers would invade through Spain. Whether or not the Spanish acquiesced to that is unclear, would have acquiesced to this. But that was definitely a possibility that then the Nazis could have controlled the Azores Island and disrupted Allied shipping. And in fact, the Americans even had a plan to invade the Azores to defend Allied shipping. So there's actually a lot of action in this later period. You know, also there's the prospect, you can see kind of early on, there's a lot of volatility that the Portuguese alliance with England would be activated. This is one of the oldest alliances in world history, dating back to the 14th century. And so there's the possibility that the Portuguese would intervene on the Allied side and perhaps get involved. Ultimately, Iberia remained neutral. Portuguese activate their alliance with the British very late in the war. And so Iberia remains neutral, but there was certainly the prospect that Portugal would get entangled. So what do the authors find? They find that Portuguese returns are negatively affected by these events. And actually, I'm a bit surprised because the authors, I think, are mixing several effects together. They're still getting something. So they're mixing together, I think, good events that are good for Portuguese stocks. They're mixing together bad events where the level of stock returns would be lower. And then they're mixing in uncertain or risky events where there the return variance would be higher, and then probably the return is lower because uncertainty has negative effects. So I think that actually there's a prospect to get better results by a different classification system if they more clearly delineate events that they think would be clearly positive or clearly negative. So, you know, things that make, you know, the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War doing better, potentially winning the war, that's bad, clearly. There's some that are less clear. You know, if the Nationalists win, maybe they invade, maybe Franco will invade. But there's clearly some uncertain or risky events that might be better to classify separately to see if you can get those results here. So I propose an alternative classification. I'm going to give the authors a lot of work. So I'd suggest instead of their classification by Republican and Nationalist and positive or negative, they think about events that make a Republican victory more likely or a Nationalist victory more likely. It's not clear that the current classification does that. Events that make Portuguese intervention in Spain more or less likely. There's also the French that are looming. They're, you know, a major military power, and you know, there's a prospect that they may intervene, and that may be more or less likely depending on events in France. So most of the events in France are classified with the Republican side, but some make intervention more or less likely, and that clearly would have probably swung the tide to the Republican side. It could have potentially avoided maybe avoided World War II entirely if the democracies of the world had stopped fascist aggression in Spain. There's also whether the British intervention is more or less likely, or whether the Portuguese alliance with England is activated. So there's a prospect that Portugal will enter World War II eventually on the English side, and that may be related to events in the Spanish Civil War. So, you know, I don't have a lot of time, but, you know, some comments on, you know, some of the classifications. You know, they say that, you know, when in 36, when the different parties are forming the Republican side, you know, is it possible to forecast the war at this point? And, you know, the coup itself, you know, the attempted coup, the military uprising, well, it's mostly defeated. But, you know, maybe if the Republicans had won the war, we would have seen this as a clear time when the Republicans, you know, blocked the coup and would eventually win. You know, these are coded the same. There's the death of an anarchist, where, you know, that's considered a Republican thing. And then there's also the execution of a nationalist leader. You know, are those really the same? There's a lot of events that are not clearly about the Spanish Civil War, so that could be useful to consider. But then maybe we want to consider this more broadly. The Munich Agreement is not really about the Spanish Civil War. The Portuguese elections are not really about the Spanish Civil War. Germany invading Czechoslovakia and Soviet show trials. So maybe those are useful to consider, but I don't think they're really about the Spanish Civil War. Franco sees all his opponents die in suspicious airline crashes, but this is listed 3 times. Is this really that important, whether Franco is the leader versus some other generals? The Barcelona People's Olympiad is canceled. They have this kind of Republican or socialist Olympic Games. How important is this? Or, the trial of the Trotskyites. I mean, it's clear they're on the outs before then. There's a lot of events in France, but, once Blum is in power, and Blum is this left-winger in France, once he's in power and he's not intervening, then it's pretty clear that the more moderate or liberal politicians that take over in France are not going to intervene. So once Blum is prime minister and he doesn't intervene on the Republican side, it's pretty clear that the more moderate politicians are not. So there's probably not that much information there. There's a lot of events that are, not clear whether they're good or bad. The Portuguese government forbids people from intervening. Well, that's probably good. And British government is kind of pressuring Portugal not to intervene. That's probably good for Portuguese stocks again. And at the end of the Civil War, Negrin is deciding, not to push for peace negotiations. That's kind of a sign of weakness, I think. And the authors talk about this, but at the end of the Civil War, it's pretty clear they've won by 39. The Nationalists have won, and so there's more events that don't have much information or revelation. So I think in terms of overall, in terms of the stock returns, you want to think about when the information is revealed. That's really what's going to move things. Here, there's not much information. All right, so that's the end of those. Let me continue on to the next talk. We just saw this very nice paper by Francois Bildy. So in terms of the strong points, they've got Francois has just an incredible amount of high frequency data. That's very hard to get before 1929. He's going to attack the question in a lot of different ways. He's got cross-sectional end time series data. And I found this one of the most enjoyable COVID papers out there. There's a lot of competition. So in terms of counterfactuals, we might think what the 1918 recession looks like, and that's what this paper mostly addresses. But a lot of people are interested in the question, are pandemic recessions severe in general or not? And so Francois is going to talk about some of the other things that are going on. But for example, in 29, the shock is not all that big. Maybe the 1918 negative shock of the pandemic is much bigger, but the 1918 economy is overheating from the wartime boom. You get an inflationary boom. And so, maybe in a counterfactual world, this actually would have been a severe recession. So, maybe I'm asking the author to write a different paper, but, it's something to think about. They do address this a little bit, but it's something to think about relative to, say, 2021. Maybe the shock is actually smaller in 2021. It's just the economy is not overheating there. Another thing to think about, can we use the present to learn about the past? Usually this goes the other way, but, in our current situation, we may have already exited the recession. And so, I would advise the author not to publish too quickly because we may get some sense about how pandemic recessions go from this current experience. It may give some inference about what we might want to think about in terms of 1918, in terms of the kind of extraordinary monetary and fiscal stimulus that's kind of similar to this historic period. How fast we recover this time might tell us something about 1918. In terms of international aspects, obviously the armistice has a bigger impact on Europe, but the embargo of Germany continues. The paper doesn't actually mention exports, that I could tell from just Control F. And exports are important. The US economy is still fairly agricultural in 1918, and a big part of the wartime boom is exports. So I could see this going both ways from the armistice. Maybe Europeans import more as there's no more tax on shipping with the armistice, or maybe Europeans start to resume domestic production and there's actually going to be fewer American exports. So something to think about. Maybe this is not possible too, but maybe this is a big data collection effort. It would be interesting to see where the wartime contracts for World War I were going, to see how fiscal policy is interacting with the pandemic. This is possible for World War II. There's been some papers that look at where wartime contracts are going. Since you have a lot of great disaggregated data, then you can kind of see this as the wartime footing continues through your armistice. In fact, the kind of American war effort is still ramping up, in fact, because it only starts in 1917. And so you should still have a lot of these wartime contracts if it's possible to get them. And the universe should be smaller than World War II as well. So you could get some nice cross-sectional variation. So thanks for tuning in. Sorry I have limited time, but I really enjoyed both papers. They're both very nice papers.
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. So now since we only have a few minutes left, I'd like to just give each panelist a few minutes to respond to some of the questions and comments that Gabriel raised about each of their papers. So if we could start with João, if you'd like to respond to any of the points raised in the discussion, please do so, and then we'll have Francois join in.
Okay, thank you so much, Gabriel, for your very, very interesting comments. I just want to say that most of your concerns were also our concerns, and we tried to tackle them in the robustness exercises. For example, we did not, in one of these exercises, we removed 1939 from the sample, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, and the result still holds. We also have a more conservative definition of events, where we exclude all these international and Portuguese events. And the result, even though it's a little bit less statistically significant, it's still there. And I think it's a very good idea to try to divide between good and bad events. But there's a normative aspect here that we are not exactly sure how to handle, but we'll think deeper about that. So thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you also for your comments. I'll be very quick. The spirit of this is it's a counterexample. So I'm not trying to make a statement about the effect of pandemics in general. I'm just saying they need not be catastrophic. I like very much your idea of comparison with shock in 1929 or 1920. But to do this properly, one would need a model, which I'm not using here. Your point about exports is very interesting. I think that plays a huge role in the build-up to the 1920 recession, when exports keep booming to Europe and then they collapse. And thank you also for the suggestion on wartime contracts. There's definitely more work to be done there. Also, I suspect on what predicts the impact, the cross-sectional impact of the epidemic. I think there's some probably hidden correlations there. But I'm more interested in hearing other questions.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions on Twitter. I'll say one for each of our panelists, so that way we can transition quickly in responding to them. For João, in your paper you mentioned that your data suggests that Portuguese investors cared only if the Republicans, those on the left, won the Civil War. Was there any concern if Franco or the Nationalists, or if the war kept going, or is there any uncertainty in the stock market over whether or not the war continues? And then for Francois, in your paper, is there any evidence on whether or not closing in various precincts causes some areas to suffer more or less based on geography, either in 1918 or in 1920 and 21 during that downturn? I'm also curious to learn more about the Amazon effect that you pointed out in the retail sales, if there's anything more to it, if it persists beyond 1918. So I'll leave those questions with each of you, and we'll see if we receive any others, but feel free to respond.
I can start. So we do not necessarily argue that that is the effect. We find this effect empirically. By using qualitative evidence, we also from there are so there are in the archives we found letters between Salazar and the head of one of the biggest banks, which is called Banco Espírito Santo, and it seemed the regime was clearly favoring Franco's side. It was also supporting them with capturing people that was fleeing from the border, so they were giving these rebels back to Franco and so on. But for Salazar, he was worried about. He was worried if a strong unified Spain would be able to invade Portugal. So winning the war very quickly was not what we believe was not on his best interest. And that's a little bit of what we find. We do not find a very high impact of the nationalists winning battles or having political victories. That effect is basically non-significant. The negative impact is coming from the left winning, especially military victories.
I think we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go into detail, but I would urge the questioner to look at the paper. I do go into the use of cross-sectional data to make inferences about the impact of closings on the economy. I mean, one big difficulty is that the timing of the closings is not completely exogenous. In fact, it's correlated with the spread of the epidemic. And the spread of the epidemic was from east to west, and that's correlated with tons of other things like the level of development and all of the economic history of the late 19th century in the US. So the advantage of the method that I use, which is to use the dynamics of the epidemic and see how the closings affect those dynamics. And as I mentioned, but very quickly, the closings do reduce the spread of the epidemic. They reduce the loss of output through infected people being unable to go to work. So if you reduce the epidemic, there's fewer sick people and there's more people going to work. But that's not significantly estimated. It's pretty small. And there's also a direct economic cost of the closings. But again, it's pretty small on the order of 5% and not significant, which is not surprising given that, as I said, the closings really affected the entertainment business, but not the general business. Oh, and the Amazon effect, that seemed to be pretty short-lived. It's Sears Roebuck and the mail order businesses. So there was a bump up. Drugstores also did very well during the pandemic as people rushed to buy all sorts of drugs. But that fell away very quickly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you for joining us. On behalf of the Online Economic History Workshop organizers, we thank our presenters, João Pereira dos Santos and Francois Velde. We also thank our discussant, Gabriel Mathy, for his thoughts and comments on each of our presenters' research. And we thank you, the audience, for tuning in. If you're interested, we have another panel scheduled tomorrow at noon Eastern Time on the labor market in crisis, presented here on YouTube. And if you're interested in learning more about the Online Economic History Workshop, please go to www.oehw.org. Thank you.